All right. Welcome to another episode of Blazin, Grazin, and Other Wild Things. Today's episode, I think we're going to talk a little bit about some deer forage, deer food.
Yeah.
For that.
Yeah, it's that time of year. You know, bucks are growing antlers, does are trying to produce milk for fawns, and obviously it's maybe not deer season, so maybe it's the time of year when people aren't thinking about deer, but they should be, because obviously if they're wanting more deer on their property or having larger, healthier deer, bigger antlers, certainly this is right now the time of year whenever managers should be thinking about what do you have available for deer to eat and what you can do to increase food availability and the quality of that food. I think a good place to start is just what do deer actually eat?
Yeah.
You know, most folks, what do you call the thing that drops out of the oak tree?
Yeah. Oh.
Acorn.
An acorn. That's yeah. You probably say acorn.
I sure do. Like a normal person.
You said what?
Acorn.
Acorn.
Acorn. Yeah.
Got an E in there.
I got some folks up at a event in Pennsylvania a couple weeks ago. I said acorn, and then 2 sentences later I said soul, and they're what was that? I was like,
gosh.
Dirt, soil, soul.
Yeah.
So anyway, so you know, a lot of folks automatically think about mast because obviously in the time of year when folks are out there deer hunting, that's what deer are eating a lot of. They are eating a lot of acorns during the fall. And certainly acorns can be a useful food resource for deer, can provide, you know, good levels of fat, relatively low in protein, but good carbohydrates, good fat. But during the summertime, there's not any acorns on the ground. And so, you know, the time of year whenever these processes that are really nutritionally limiting are going on, deer are not relying on mast. They're mostly eating forbs, which are just broadleaf, non-woody plants. So, you know, most people would call them weeds, but, you know, wildflowers, etc., is a lot of what their diet is during the summertime. And then they also do eat some woody plants as well, in the form of browse. And, you know, really just throughout the year, browse and forbs make up the lion's share of a deer's diet. They'll eat a fair amount of mast in the fall. They'll eat a tiny little bit of grass, especially in the winter and spring, you know, whenever food is really limiting. But in the summertime, they're not eating grass. They're not eating acorns. You know, it's mostly just forbs and a little bit of browse. And so most people on most properties don't have near enough food to see the size of deer that they probably could attain, you know, just based on a food limitation, especially limitation of high quality food.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that, most properties do have a lot of available or a lot of food resources, but it's not available food resources. When you say too, because of they've allowed a lot of the woodies, especially some of those important browse species and stuff, to get up and to grow higher, and they're just not available. They're just not there. The plant is there, but the availability of it for those animals is not.
Sure, there certainly are a lot of places where, you know, if you let woody plants grow out of the reach of deer, they're not going to be used, of course. So, you know, not jumping too far ahead to management, but, you know, obviously using fire, using disturbances to set those back to where they're within the reach of deer, that's a great starting point. And then I think the other main issue is most places just don't have that many forbs that are available and provided.
Yep. So, you know, we use the term forbs a lot. A lot of times people just don't understand that term. And like you said earlier, weeds, you know, that's what a lot of those are. Can you give us some names of some important ones, you know, common names? Again, not always everybody's going to recognize those because common names vary from region to region, even within a state, within that. Yeah,
so in terms of specifically weeds, ragweed, pokeweed, horseweed, those are three really high quality plants that you know, provide excellent levels of protein and phosphorus.
Horseweed, you're also talking mare's tail.
Mare's tail, that's right. Yep. So yeah, which a lot of people, they turn their eyes at that one because obviously there's all sorts of issues in you know, production agriculture associated with glyphosate resistance. But from a, you know, deer forage perspective, it's a great plant. Now, certainly I understand, if you're managing for ag production and situations like that, but a little bit of scattered horseweed in an opening is certainly not going to be a problem. And so those are 3 good ones. Some others, a lot of the asters, species like daisy fleabane. So there's a variety of plants that deer eat, but really forbs are the highest quality plants, and they're the ones that are also the most limiting, because most of the time in the summertime, if deer are having to rely on woody plants, they're not meeting their nutritional requirements for maximum antler size or milk production, because unless it's woody plants that have been set back with fire, that's an exception. But the older leaves of woody plants are typically somewhere in the neighborhood of 10%, 8 to 10% protein, and 0.1 to 0.2% phosphorus, whereas forbs oftentimes are 20 to 30% protein easily, 0.3 to 0.35% phosphorus, and a lactating doe, which is the most nutritionally stressful baseline that we would want to shoot for, requires about 14% protein and about 0.3% phosphorus. So forbs are really the only type of plant that meet that, consistently over time.
So where would you throw, a plant that a lot of people don't like, greenbrier?
Yeah, so greenbrier, it depends on the time of year that you sample it, and it also depends on whether it's been set back by fire. It's kind of going to be intermediate between those baseline values for forbs and for woody plants. It's certainly, for the most part, going to be less nutritious than most of the forbs, but it is going to be better than a lot of the woody species. And again, especially if you set it back with fire and it's resprouting, it's not one that I'm necessarily managing specifically for to try to promote for deer, but I do like having some of it. But I do want some areas that are really forb heavy, because that's really where most of the nutrition during the summer is going to be provided. The advantage of greenbrier is you're also providing food in the winter as well as during the summertime.
It's crazy how long that plant will keep leaves on in the winter.
Yeah.
It shocks me sometimes in December when I'm like, greenbrier still has leaves on it.
Yeah.
And they're green.
Yeah. And I definitely think of greenbrier as being more one that I'm wanting to promote for just having some good baseline year-round food, as opposed to like really pumping out nutrients in the summertime. But it's certainly a good plant, and it's one most of the time that is going to be grown in the woods. So if you get more sunlight in those areas and start using fire, you can have that alongside some other forbs that might come up after you start doing that.
Yeah. What about a plant that we see a lot of, get a lot of hatred toward, but a lot of times people like to eat it? Blackberries.
Yep.
Is the importance is not only is, I think some of the plant material of it is edible and they utilize that, but also the soft mast is. Yep.
Yeah, so deer will eat the fruit, but they also really commonly will eat the leaves, and especially, again, in terms of the quality of plants, just like you would think about in terms of cattle forage, I mean, the older plant material is going to be less nutritious than the younger plant material, and so, but deer being even more selective in their foraging than cattle, they're termed, some people would call them browsers. Concentrate selector is the term that I typically use, and that means basically what it sounds like. They selectively forage on the parts of plants and the age of plants and the species of plants that have nutrient concentrations. They don't have as large of a rumen as a cow does, and so they can't hold as much food to process it for as long. So their processing time and the amount of food they can have has to be faster. So they're only going to eat those plants that are higher quality. So young blackberry leaves, excellent nutrition. If they're having to eat old blackberry leaves that are on down towards the ground, those are pretty indigestible or less digestible and going to have lower nutrient concentrations. So, and that's another good baseline. If you see deer having to eat, especially in the summertime, plants that are lower quality, that should be kind of ringing some bells in terms of, okay, I need to get more food out there, but I probably also need to reduce the deer density a little bit.
Well, it's like when I was in grad school at Texas Tech, had some fellow students that were working on a deer study there in Texas, and they were looking at deer diets, and wintertime diet on this one property was 50% cedar. And so it was like, there are way too many deer, and there's not any other kind of food out there.
Yeah.
That's that's a starvation type diet.
Was it high fenced?
No, it's a pretty large place. I think there were some areas that were high fenced on it. I can't remember, but they were coming up with some almost 50% of that wintertime diet.
Yeah.
Was juniper cedar.
Yeah, if they're having to eat red cedar, they're in trouble.
That's
one that's pretty. And if they're having to eat red cedar and in the Great Plains, they're in trouble. If they're eating sweet gum leaves in the southeastern part of the state, that's a bad sign too.
What's funny is I notice a lot of times, different times of the year, I see deer in certain areas, and I know they're king on certain plants. And there's one area west of Stillwater that I drive by a lot and see a lot of deer, and it's actually a Bermuda grass pasture. But I usually see a lot of deer out there, and I know they're not out there eating Bermuda grass because a lot of times too it's actually dormant. And but I know there's some forb that's coming up out there that year in, year out, it's out there at that time of year, and they're out there keying on that, because again, that's that nutrition they're going after. And
a lot of the time people see deer out in pastures and especially hay fields, and they're think, oh yeah, they got to be eating grass, and it's like, well, if you actually get down and look, there's more than. I mean, unless it's just been sprayed like crazy, which most haven't been. There's always a few forbs popping up, and it's crazy how they're keying in on that.
Wood sorrel underneath everything.
Yep. Yeah. But that also tells you that other parts of your property, like the woods, have very little food if they're out there eating tiny little forbs, amongst a sea of grass.
Yeah. Yeah, we see a lot of browsed tick clovers, it seems like.
Yep. All the desmodiums are excellent deer forage plants. I mean, I think it's good to know some species and to be able to identify, but most of the time if folks have areas that are dominated by forbs, they're going to have some good deer food plants. And the good thing with deer is if you provide all that, they can then selectively choose what they want to eat to meet different nutritional demands throughout the year. Whereas, if you only provide one thing or don't provide anything, then certainly they're going to be, struggling to meet those.
Yeah.
But what we should simply see in this part of the world, in Oklahoma Southern Great Plains, is this time of year, food shouldn't be a limiting factor, and good quality food in most places.
In parts of the Great Plains, yes, I would say as you get into if you have rainfall, if you get into the cross timbers though, it certainly can be a limitation and especially as you get into the southeastern part of the state, it certainly can be. And I
would say, are you saying some of the unmanaged cross timbers
certainly.
That's been allowed to just be cross timbers, and people think that if I don't touch anything, it'll be just fine.
Yep.
It's wildlife. It's pristine.
Yeah, it's pristine.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The places that are cedar encroached or just have a high tree density, pine forests in the southeastern part of the state that are, really high basal area. I mean, any place that doesn't have enough sun, more than at least 30 to 40% sunlight hitting the ground, and, it's not been burned in a decade, there's not going to be much high quality deer food in those places. I mean, that's pretty. So certainly, if areas are well managed, then food limitation should not be an issue this time of year. Again, especially the eastern half of the state, we get enough rain to produce plenty of deer food. The question just is, do we have the types of plants that are growing there that are going to be producing deer food, or is it cedar encroached areas, or have a bunch of trees, or a bunch of pine trees in the southeast with a dense sweet gum mid-story? So again, the limitations are different in different places, but most properties that I go to, if you're not in, if you go out to semi-arid like far western Oklahoma, certainly a lot of those places, if you get decent rain, you're going to have a lot of forbs because there's just not enough grass cover, and there's certainly not enough tree cover. And it's a part of the reason why those places produce some pretty big deer.
You're saying there's not enough to limit the forbs.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. There's not enough grass cover to limit the forbs. Whereas if you go into the eastern part of the state, certainly there's great deer produced throughout Oklahoma. But the problem in systems that have enough rainfall is you get other plants that outcompete those forbs unless active management is going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so most properties that I visit, there certainly are summer food limitations. It's just a matter of, work's not being done to alleviate that.
Yeah. So the management's going to be I think in parts of the western part of the state, as long as you weren't broadcast herbicide applications, you could probably have pretty good deer feed.
Yeah, absolutely.
As long as your grazing management is okay and everything. And
yeah.
But then on the east side, it's like if you're not actively trying to open up the canopy, it can be difficult to get.
Yeah, you're not going to have much deer forage production, and same with cedar. Like if you just let cedar encroach areas, those areas serve as cover, and deer use that. They don't have to have those areas, but they do use them for cover. But those areas are providing almost no food, and so if you're trying to increase the size of deer, you're not doing much. And something that was really interesting, I think a lot of people think either food isn't limiting in the summertime, or that they can eat on my neighbors, or whatever. We did some work across this was across most of the eastern U.S., including parts of the Great Plains, collecting deer forage on different properties. And these were places that were managed for deer specifically. And it was really interesting. Found that for every 50 pounds per acre of high quality food, and that's averaged across a property. So, some parts of the property, would have more food than others. But if you increase just property wide nutrition by about 50 pounds per acre of high quality food, you see an 8-pound increase in doe body weight and a 7-inch increase in mature buck antler size.
Wow.
And 50 pounds is actually really not that much to increase food.
It's absolutely nothing.
Yeah. So, that's not a high baseline, but 7 inches of antler on a mature buck increase. That's not nothing. That's pretty substantial. So,
that's crazy.
I think that there's a lot of good management that could be done if folks recognize, we can actually actively change, the size of deer that we're having just by increasing summer food availability.
And that's summer food.
Yeah.
I'm getting that.
Yeah. That's just food during the summertime.
Yeah. And so I guess to get into that, so what are some things we can do to increase definitely looks like the quantity of available good quality forage, and what can we do to increase the quality of that, even if it's lower quality stuff?
Right.
How can we increase it and do that to benefit whitetail deer? Yeah.
So one of the primary two tools, which are things we talk about all the time, are killing trees and burning. Yep. So if you have areas that are cedar encroached, certainly killing the cedars, regardless of whether you do that chemically or with
But I just bought this property because it had cedar on it. That's where deer are.
That's right. Yeah. Here's the thing: if you have other woody plants, those provide cover for deer just the same as cedar does. There's nothing magical about eastern red cedar for deer.
So is there something good about having something that provides cover as well as food, the same plant?
Exactly. Yeah.
Whereas one just provides cover and nothing else?
Exactly. Yeah. So reducing or eliminating cedar, that's a great way to increase deer food availability. In parts of the cross timbers or, eastern Oklahoma, killing trees, whether that's broadcast herbicide, with something like Spike, or doing more selective with either girdle and spray and hack and squirt to open up the canopy in cross timbers forest, heavy thinning in pine forest in the southeast. Basically the whole thing is get more sunlight on the ground and then use fire. Not to beat a dead horse with the fire thing, but that really there's
nothing that
mimics fire. Yeah.
So going back to the tree aspect of it, to the hack and squirt, girdling, spraying, What about, and when does or would be like hinge cutting or just cutting stuff off down and not spraying it to get it to resprout? So which one of those browse species, tree species should we be choosing? Is it also about tree density, how many trees we have on a property? Can you go into that?
Yeah, so it all depends on objectives and what you want to work on, but hinge cutting I typically think about for cover, not necessarily for food, because even though you've dropped the canopy down, those leaves are still going to be the same quality, whereas if you create a stump sprout, or a mineral stump as some folks call them, by just flush cutting the tree, letting it resprout, those nutrients are going to be, or those leaves are going to be much more nutrient dense, right. And they're actually going to rival some of the forbs in terms of the mineral content of some of those nutrients, as that tree's trying to regrow those leaves and push nutrients out of the root system. And so whenever we have, we can do that on some species. I like doing that on species like black gum, elm, really any of the elm species are good. Red maple's another good one in especially the southeast.
What about hackberry, which is something we see a lot of times?
Hackberries.
We see large hackberries, encroaching areas even in western Oklahoma.
Hackberry's an excellent one. Osage orange is another one. Really, even some of the oaks. I'll do it on about any species, but it really comes down to, the density of trees. Like I don't want to just create a jungle of resprouts per se, because those will get out of the reach of deer within a couple years, but doing a couple here and there, that's fine. And then the other thing I think about too is just not doing that with non-native species. Obviously, if you've got an invasive tree, tree of heaven for instance, just kill it. You do not need to try to create a stump sprout out of that. Right. But yeah, that's a great way to basically turn a low quality forage or even forage that's not there because it's in the canopy into something higher quality. And then, fire is another way to do that. Obviously with fire, you can use it to promote forbs, hopefully, but you can also use it to create fresh growth on both some of those trees that you top kill that resprout, but also some of those semi-woody species like blackberry, greenbrier. Those are all going to resprout, and those fresh leaves are going to be more nutritious as well. Yeah. And so thinking about, especially if you're trying to really maximize food availability or food quality, thinking about the timing of burning can be important for those woody resprouts, because if you burn something in, say, February, by the time you get to by the time you get to June or July, when those nutritional demands are peaking, the quality of those leaves isn't going to be that much different than if you hadn't burned. Now, that's not to say to not burn, but that's just to say that the quality of that plant, it's had enough time to regrow, compared to if you burn something in, say, May or June, that's going to be pumping out really fresh growth. And so that's not to say to burn everything in May or June, but burning a little bit in that time of year can be good, because you then are promoting, resprouting of those plants just at the time whenever nutritional demands are peaking. And deer, you can see them really hone into those areas that are freshly burned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. We saw that, we definitely saw that shift in our pastures that have the cattle and the goats. Mm-hmm. The eating on the resprouts after fire on the blackberry and the dogwood and the sumac and stuff. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
So, and we don't know. It could have been deer in there too. Who knows? They go where they want, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. They, any of those species that are eating those woody plants, they're gonna hone in on that freshly burned stuff. Yeah. And again, that's part of why we talk about burning throughout the year, because if you burn something on your property every couple months, it's going to be resprouting and fresh, and you can have good attraction there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's exactly what you're saying. It'd be great to burn something every month.
Yeah,
something within there to get that, to get and maintain that quality. Because you think about that plane of nutrition you're maintaining with that, because again, we know from time since something was burned, quality, it'll peak immediately, and then the quality starts to fall off immediately too.
Yeah.
And so the more freshly burned stuff that we have, the plane of nutrition can be really high. So if that is where we're worried about does being able to produce, maintaining twins, maintaining ability to produce enough milk and have high quality, or we want large antler growth on bucks. Planes of nutrition is important.
Yeah, and I mean even thinking about, this isn't necessarily talking about summer food, but I mean if you burn something in September, it's going to be resprouting in October during bow season, and you can see great use of that as well.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, I know from the the forage quality stuff that we've done with livestock production, we've seen that our July, August, September burns, we're maintaining higher quality all the way into December compared to not burning, or a spring burn, or not burning at all.
Yep.
Compared to that, that stuff nosedives, and usually by the time dormant season, first frost gets there in first part of November around this part of the world, that quality is just at the bottom. But whereas those burned areas that were burned in July, August, September, they're maintaining some. It's not sky high, but it's a whole lot better than anything else that's out there.
Absolutely, yeah. And it doesn't have to be sky, or at least for deer, it does not have to be sky high. As you get on into September, October. I mean, you don't want them eating stuff that's terrible, but their nutritional demands definitely drop off as you move into the fall compared to as it would be during the summertime.
Yeah, it was surprising on the season of burn plots just how many. I expected all the woody plants and the grasses and everything to resprout, but how many of the forbs resprouted after we burned them in the summer? They'd regrow, and then they're growing later in the year, and that was really interesting.
Yeah, I know. I've probably said before, it's amazing the plants that you can see. Like if you burned in June or July or even August, the plants that you see come back and flower quickly that typically you never see except in April, May, or June, and they're flowering again in August. You're scratching your head going, that should not be. That's bloomed 3 months ago.
Yeah.
But it rebloomed again, and again producing quality, forage that could be out there for livestock, is deer especially.
Yeah. But yeah, we see really strong deer selection, within 2 months after the fire, and then it kind of tails off to be similar to something that was burned a little bit longer ago. After that period, so absolutely, yeah, you can use fire. And then the other thing with deer forage that I think that a lot of folks have a misperception about. I mean, the typical dogma was to burn something every 3 to 5 years to maintain to maintain deer habitat, and I think that's a fairly poor prescription in most parts of, especially the eastern half of Oklahoma. Now, again, as we always talk about, you go out west, it changes. But in the eastern half of Oklahoma, you're not maintaining high quality deer food if you're, especially burning every 4 to 5 years. That's not frequent enough.
Well, and I would say even in western Oklahoma, from work that we've done over the years, we found that this isn't looking at nutritional quality, but again, we can show you that the time since fire quality goes way down. But looking at percent cover, sand sagebrush was one of these species, sand shinnery oak in western Oklahoma was another one, that within 3 years post-fire, the cover is back to the same cover. So that means it's adapted to fire, it's growing, and it's back to what it was before you ever burned. And so that's going to tell you the quality is going to be down low again and doing all that. So again, that frequent fire, it's everywhere. And also, if you look at the fire return maps and historic data and stuff that's out there, again, this part of the world showed every 2 to 4 years that we need to be burning. But you're exactly right. The more rainfall you get, the quicker that stuff can recover. Yeah. Again, the fire frequent needs to be there. Same thing, and it's going to decline, but.
Yeah, and especially if I'm in a system where like a pine forest system where I've got a bunch of woody. Maybe I've opened the canopy, but I've got a bunch of woody plants there. I'm probably burning it every single year if I'm trying to increase deer food because, until you, even if you really push those woody plants back, there's so much of a seed base for things like sweet gum seeding in that you really have to set that stuff back with really frequent fire to move the needle.
But you're not saying though too that you shouldn't burn every inch of your property every year.
Correct. Right. No, I just mean if I have a stand, either a forest stand or a pasture or a burn unit that I'm like, I really want this to be high quality food for deer, I'm probably going to burn it every 1 to 2 years in the eastern half of the state. But yeah, you're right. I wouldn't burn my entire property every year because then you've got other resources that you're not going to be providing.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing to look at too, right, is that what else is around you?
Right. Yeah. The landscape context is a huge thing, and some of the other things that we've seen with some of that research I was talking about earlier was, the amount of agriculture that you have around you that has a strong effect, especially within, say, 5 miles of your property, that has a pretty strong effect on, the size of deer that you might expect, because that's going to clearly change the amount of food that's available there. So, if you have more agriculture around you, maybe the timing, maybe you don't need as much late summer food if you have, say, soybeans, but maybe you do need more early summer food because those fields are not providing something, immediately. But for the majority of landowners, there certainly are going to be some food limitations that they can pick out and try to manage around on their property to try to maintain a higher nutritional plane. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about your favorite subject, food plots. So, a lot of folks, whenever they think about, and I think this has shifted a lot. I've felt, at least over the last 5 to 10 years, especially the last 5 years, there has been a lot more interest in just good, basic habitat management practices, as opposed to just jumping to, okay, what can I plant for deer? But there are still a lot of people that ask, what can I plant for deer? And so, food plots, I think, can be a small piece of the puzzle. But at the end of the day, you're talking on average 3 to 5% of somebody's property. And on some properties, it's less than that. But on, a lot of places, it's like 3 to 5% if they have deer as a primary objective. And so that leaves 95 to 97% of the property that could be managed better. And, you can produce more food in a food plot per acre than you can in basically any other vegetation type, because all of that food plot should be deer food. You fertilized it. And
if it makes.
Well, yeah, of course. Of course. But for sure. And so there are disadvantages to that strategy, though, because you have all this input on this small acreage compared to if you just manage the rest of the property as a whole. Your deer wouldn't be reliant on food plots for their nutrition. So food plots should definitely be viewed as either just a place, to hunt and view deer, or maybe you view them as a supplement, a supplemental food source. But if that's your baseline level of nutrition and deer are relying on 3% of your property to get all that they need, that's not good.
And again, it's just like people that want to manage oaks all the time for acorn production, which is only 5 to 6 weeks out of the year and only in the fall. Again, when is this food plot going to provide that kind of thing? Now, so let's say, I guess here would be a good question, I think, to me is, so when is more than likely most of the time what period of time is nutrition the most limiting factor for deer? And then I could see, could we plant something in that food plot to help them meet that through that rough period of time? Would that be dead part of winter? Would that be in the summer?
So the two primary periods whenever deer food is most limiting would be in terms of just food availability period would be the dead of winter. And so there certainly are some cool season annuals. Even something as simple as wheat, but also, species like crimson clover. Those can provide, some good nutrition during the period of time whenever, dead of winter, most native plants are, not actively growing. But at that time of year, deer are also eating a lot of browse. And so if you just provide browse, you can also help meet those nutritional needs. And then the other period would be, the summertime. And so certainly there are some forages that you could plant that would increase summer food availability, but that comes at a cost. Most folks are not planting warm season annuals in their food plots. They're probably focusing just on those cool season plantings. And so, what I like to do for the most part is, try to incorporate some species into the cool season plantings that would provide some summer nutrition. So species like arrowleaf clover and red clover, if you plant those in the fall, those will provide some nutrition, again, assuming we get some rainfall all the way through, the end of June for arrowleaf clover. Red clover, you'll get a couple months past that. And I mean, obviously, you could manage it as a perennial planting at that point, but you do get some extended nutrition with those. But again, you're talking a small percentage of the property, and so yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. But I still think that at the end of the day, if your baseline forage is poor, then food plots are not going to make up for that.
Some of those species you talked about, they're good for the eastern third of the state.
Yeah.
What about the western 2/3 of the state where rainfall becomes a limiting factor?
Yep.
And especially we talk about, dead of winter being that, again, December, January, February is the driest months of the year in Oklahoma, and trying to maintain and grow something out there that could, be a resource for deer. What like I said, there's some cool season annuals, grasses again, but deer aren't just huge browsers.
Yeah.
Or grazers, excuse me.
Yep.
They're not huge grazers on grassy plants, but
yeah, they will eat the cereal grains pretty well in the wintertime. So, cereal rye, winter wheat, oats as well. Although oats will winter kill. They'll eat those pretty well. So yeah, I think that having those in food plots is a good idea. But again, some years you're going to get no rain and it's not going to be anything. So that all comes back to, again, I like food plots. I think they have a place for most folks interested in deer management and especially deer hunting. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, they're not moving the needle on management for the most part.
Yeah, it sounds like if you would put the same amount of money and time into managing the property,
yes,
as you would in trying to get a crop to come up in a food plot,
yes,
life would be better off.
Yeah, for most managers should view and landowners should view food plots as a place that they like to go hunt, and they're attracting deer there for hunting. And that then means that they're not having to put as much time into it because they can shrink the acreage that they're having to plant. And so yes, I think that if you're going to do them, you might as well think a little bit about the food that they're providing. But if you're thinking about that providing food, then you're thinking about this wrong.
Yeah.
So, Mark, if you had, say you had fescue and you were trying to increase the food availability in your fescue pasture in the summer, what would you do there?
Yeah. Just kill the fescue. That would be my go-to would be, any time you've got non-native grasses, again, obviously you've got to figure out how that fits into your production goals. Mm-hmm. But if you can do it, kill the grasses off. And, if it's not an area that you're worrying about for production, just killing the grass off and letting forbs come up is going to be the best way to do that. If you are then thinking about, production, more of a production system, then maybe you have to think about it a little bit differently. But if you're just purely trying to increase deer food where there's non-native grasses, just kill the grass and let the forbs come on.
I guess one thing we hadn't really touched on is what you see some people trying to do and thinking they're doing it. What's the thoughts? What's the research on that? Is feeding.
Yeah. So certainly, on the average, we recommend against feeding wildlife. I think there's a lot of issues that come with feeding wildlife, from disease implications to feeding predators. A lot of the time with, if we're feeding especially corn. We can be supplementing raccoon and coyote populations, which can be a negative for for turkeys and for quail and for other ground nesting birds. And so there are just inherent problems with feeding that I would say just right off the bat cause pause there. But when you look at the data on feeding, it's really interesting. Even some of the places in Texas where, Texas is kind of the king of feeding wildlife because, again, they don't get the rainfall to have consistent forb and, just high quality food production year in and year out. And so I would have thought that in a system like that, feeding would kind of level things out where it's like, okay, yep, things are more level, where you don't see these dips in antler size, for instance, or in productivity in those drought years. Well, it does that a little bit, but it doesn't get rid of it. So you still see dips, even with ad libitum supplemental feed, spending tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars a year per ranch on feed.
That goes back to the other thing, is the cost.
It's incredibly expensive compared to the other practices we have. But even in a system like that where you have this drought limitation, you still see those dips and in those drought years. And so that's saying to me the native vegetation is important, and the increase in antler size is there in those really dry systems, but it's much less of a bump than you might expect. You're talking you're talking a few inches here, a few inches there. For how much money that you spent, to me, you look at the economics of it, it's not worth it. You'd be much, much better off spending your time and money on native plant management, even if native plant management ended up costing you, because say you had to adjust either your grazing system or especially thinking about in the southeast, maybe you have to reduce your stocking rate on your trees a little bit. You're not growing as many trees per acre because you're letting more sunlight in. The economics of doing that far outweigh the cost of the feeder. Because, you think a feeder even a big feeder, you're going to hold, 500 pounds in? Mm-hmm. And you start thinking about, okay, deer eat 5 pounds of food per day roughly. And you take that 500-pound feeder and all the feed in it, and you spread it out across, the acres of ground that are surrounding it. And suddenly it's like, well, yeah, there's like 1 pellet per square foot. Well, of course you're not seeing a big bump in nutrition. You're spending all this money, but the deer are just not eating enough of it, and you're not having enough provided. Even if you had a really high feeder density, the deer are going to eat the native plants too. Yeah. And so I think even in like the worst case scenario where things are really dry, there's really limited food, like a lot of the work in South Texas, you're bumping nutrition from feeding, and the associated bump in deer size, deer productivity, survival, etc. It's not that big. Yeah. And in most of those systems, really what we oftentimes think about using feed to increase the size of deer. Down there, a lot of what it really comes down to is they can increase the number of deer they can have. And so, sure, that makes sense, but that's in places outside of just dry South Texas, that's not an issue. We can produce as much feed for as many deer as we want to, and maintain density within reason. But in a lot of those systems, they're feeding really just to increase the number of deer they can have, more so than increasing the individual size. So, in any of Oklahoma, I would say we get enough rainfall and we have enough deer that I would focus on burning, cutting trees, again, depending on the part of the state that you're in, and then, keeping deer density in check to where you're not having, too many deer relative to the amount of food you have available. And you're going to see great increases in that without ever having to spend a penny on buying feed. Mm-hmm. Another thing too is how much time does feeding take?
Yeah.
Going out there to fill your feeders,
what's your labor worth, fuel costs, things like that. All the associated inputs.
Yeah, a drip torch is a drip torch and a chainsaw, or and maybe a little bit of herbicide, or kind of the easy ways to change deer forage availability, and they're pretty cheap.
Yep, I'm doing that. All right, well, great stuff. So I think we'll shut her off here, and get that. So thanks for another great episode of Blazin, Grazin, and Other Wild Things.